He thought trimming his own hedges was the simplest part of homeownership, but when the clippers went quiet, what followed wasn't about shrubs or property lines. It was about power, prejudice, and control. One woman's act of destruction would ignite a battle that went far beyond the garden, a fight where the real roots weren't in the soil, but in something much darker. What happened next forced a man to choose between silence and defiance. And the wall he built wasn't just made of cinder blocks. It was made of history. Because when neighbors crossed the line, how far would you go to take back your dignity? And that's just the beginning. Wait until you see how the entire neighborhood turned against him. Derek wasn't a man who looked for trouble. He worked long shifts at the factory, came home to his modest house, and spent his evenings fixing little things around the yard. It was the kind of routine life most people wouldn't notice, and that's exactly how he liked it. The hedge along his fence had grown tall, almost wild, so on a warm Saturday morning he grabbed his clippers and got to work. It was nothing more than an ordinary chore. Sweat on his brow, the quiet hum of the neighborhood, the smell of fresh-cut leaves. But in neighborhoods like this, peace could shatter in seconds. A passing glance from across the street, a neighbor's eyes narrowing, not at the hedges, but at Derek himself. And suddenly, the sound of clippers cutting branches would soon be replaced by something far sharper. Because for some people, a black man working in his own yard was never just that. It was a problem waiting to be twisted into something else. Derek didn't know it yet, but this simple task was about to spiral into a confrontation that would test everything: his patience, his pride, and his very right to belong. And when the first words were spoken, Derek realized the hedge wasn't the only thing being cut down that day. The clippers stopped mid-swing when the first words hit him. Sharp, cutting, and laced with something Derek had heard too many times before. From across the fence, a woman's voice rose, accusing, mocking, already twisting the scene into something it wasn't. She wasn't talking about the hedge. She was talking about him, about who he was, about where she thought he belonged. And in that moment, Derek realized this wasn't going to be just another Saturday chore. At first, he tried to ignore it. Years of being told to just let it go echoed in his head. Keep your head down. Don't cause a scene. But the words kept coming, louder, harsher, designed to draw blood without leaving a mark. She called him out for things he hadn't done, claimed he was damaging property that wasn't his, insisted he had no right to be there at all. It was his yard, his hedge, his home. Yet somehow, she spoke as if he was the intruder. Derek's hands tightened around the clippers. He wanted to believe it would stop if he stayed silent. But it didn't. Soon, she had her phone in hand, snapping pictures, threatening to call it in. Not the HOA, not even a neighborly complaint. No, she went straight for the biggest weapon people like her always seem to reach for: the police. And that's when Derek's chest tightened, because he knew what a call like that could mean. The weight of history pressed heavy on his shoulders. He'd seen it before. How a lie could turn into a report, how a report could turn into flashing lights, and how flashing lights could turn into something far worse. And yet, in this quiet street, with the smell of fresh-cut leaves still in the air, she was willing to drag him into that nightmare. Not because of what he did, but because of who he was. Neighbors began to peek out their doors. Some whispered, some filmed. Nobody stepped forward. The street that had once been silent now buzzed with a cruel kind of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The isolation sank deep, dozens of eyes, and not one voice speaking in his defense. It wasn't just her anymore. It was the whole block, complicit in their silence. Then came the moment that made Derek's blood run cold. A black and white car rolled slowly down the street, lights off, but presence undeniable. The call had gone through. And just like that, the hedge wasn't the problem anymore. He was. The air felt heavier, tighter, each second stretching out as he tried to steady his breath. Would they believe him? Would they even let him explain? Or would he be written off before he ever had a chance to speak? The officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene. She was already talking, animated, pointing, spinning a story before Derek could utter a word. He stood frozen, clippers dangling at his side, aware of every twitch, every breath, every move that might be misread. The ground beneath his feet felt less like his yard and more like a trap. The officer's gaze shifted to Derek, and in that instant, silence fell over the street. Every neighbor, every camera phone, every whispered judgment hung in the balance. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on that moment. One wrong step, one misunderstood gesture, and the story would write itself before he ever had a chance to defend it. But just when Derek thought the confrontation had reached its peak, something happened that neither he nor anyone else on that street was prepared for. The officers closed in, their footsteps crunching against the pavement, each one heavier than the last. Derek stood frozen in his own yard, clippers hanging limp at his side, while the woman across the fence painted him as a criminal. Her voice grew sharper, faster, every word dripping with urgency, as if she was the one in danger. And the more she spoke, the more their eyes locked onto him like a threat that needed to be neutralized. One officer's hand hovered near his belt, fingers brushing against the holster. Derek's stomach dropped. He'd seen this before, not here, not personally, but on the news, in headlines, in names etched into memory. 1,000 stories that all started just like this. His mind screamed at him to stay calm, to move slowly, to say nothing that could be twisted. But his heart raced, thundering in his chest so loud he wondered if they could hear it. The woman pointed at the hedge, at the clippers, at Derek himself. "Aggressive," she said, threatening. Words that could be as dangerous as bullets. He wanted to shout back, to tell the truth, that this was his yard, his life, his right. But every instinct told him the wrong word could turn this scene into tragedy. The silence became suffocating, a trap he couldn't escape. One officer finally spoke, sharp and commanding. "Drop it!" Derek looked down at the clippers, a tool that suddenly felt like a weapon in their eyes. Slowly, he let them fall, the metal clanging against the concrete louder than it should have been. Every neighbor flinched, as if waiting for something irreversible to happen. And then came the cruelest cut of all. The officer didn't just question him, he didn't just check his ID. He made him kneel, on the very grass Derek had mowed, on the ground he paid for, in front of the house he worked years to own. A man reduced to nothing but suspicion, stripped of dignity while the woman stood smug, her story winning over the silence of the crowd. Phones were out recording, but Derek knew how those recordings could be spun. To some, it would look like justice. To others, it would look like shame. And in that moment, kneeling in the dirt, he realized this wasn't just about him. It was about every man who had been forced down before him and every man who might be forced down after. The weight of history pressed harder than the officer's stare. Derek's eyes burned, not from fear alone, but from the anger of knowing that no matter what he said, no matter what he proved, his word would never outweigh hers. And yet, what happened next didn't just change the moment. It changed everything about how Derek would choose to fight back. Eventually, the officers left. No arrest, no charges, just the bitter taste of humiliation left behind in Derek's own front yard. The hedge still stood half-trimmed, the clippers still lay on the concrete, but Derek himself felt stripped bare. Neighbors drifted back inside as if nothing had happened, doors shutting, blinds closing, silence swallowing the street again. For everyone else, it was over. For Derek, it was only beginning. That night, as he sat alone in his living room, the images replayed again and again. The weight of kneeling on his own grass, the smugness in her voice as she twisted lies into power. The officer's eyes, cold and assessing, as if he was one breath away from being a headline. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was personal, a stain that reached deeper than any wound. But out of that pain came a decision. Derek realized that staying silent, swallowing the anger, pretending it never happened, that would only give her victory. So he chose differently. He documented what had happened, spoke with community leaders, and made sure his story didn't fade into the shadows. If they wanted to treat him like he didn't belong, then he would make his presence impossible to ignore. The hedge grew back, but what grew inside Derek was stronger, resolve. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about every man who had ever been forced to prove his humanity in places he already called home. It was about every neighbor who chose silence instead of truth. It was about a system that allowed suspicion to matter more than dignity. And that's the truth that lingers. These stories aren't rare. They're repeated over and over in different streets with different names, but the same script. Innocence turned into suspicion. Ordinary moments turned into threats. Lives forever altered because of the color of skin. Derek's story is just one thread in a much larger fabric, woven from struggle, resilience, and the painful question we're all left with. How many more times will this have to happen before change is no longer a promise but a reality?